I am going to tell you something that most travel YouTubers will not tell you. I did not like Nha Trang. I spent time there. I walked the beaches, I ate the food, I explored the streets, I talked to the people who live there and the people who chose to stay there for months, and at the end of it, I packed my bag and left earlier than I had planned. Not because Nha Trang is a bad place. It is not. But because it is a city that has been pulled in two directions at once, and somewhere in the middle of that pull, it lost something that the other Vietnamese cities I visited still have. Here is the other thing I noticed in Nha Trang. The signs on the restaurants were in Russian, the menus outside the cafes were in Russian, the real estate listings on the corner were in Russian. The woman at the pharmacy greeted me in Russian before she tried English. I was in Vietnam, but something felt different here. This video is about both of those things. Why I found Nha Trang the most disappointing city in Vietnam, and why at exactly the same time, it has become one of the most popular destinations in Asia for Russian travelers. These two stories are connected. And understanding the connection tells you something important, not just about Nha Trang, but about what happens to any beautiful place when the world decides it wants a piece of it. Let me start with what Nha Trang is supposed to be. On paper, it is perfect, a bay that curves for 6 kilometers along the central Vietnamese coast. Water that is genuinely clear and warm, a backdrop of green hills that drop steeply into the sea. A city large enough to have good restaurants, reliable transport, and decent infrastructure, but small enough that you can walk most of it in an afternoon. The photographs are stunning. The drone footage is the kind that makes you immediately search for flights. And when you arrive, the first hour delivers on the promise. The bay is beautiful. The light on the water in the early morning is extraordinary. The hills behind the city are dramatic. Standing on the beach at 6 in the morning before the city wakes up, Nha Trang looks exactly like what everyone told you it would be. Then the day begins. And slowly, incrementally, something starts to feel off. Let me be specific, because vague disappointment is not useful. The specific things that did not work for me in Nha Trang are worth understanding, because they will matter to you depending on what you are looking for. The beach itself is the first issue. Nha Trang's main beach runs along Tran Phu Boulevard, the main coastal road that borders the city. It is public, it is free, and it is lined for almost its entire length with beach chairs and umbrellas belonging to the hotels and resorts that sit behind it. If you are a guest at one of those hotels, the beach is comfortable and well serviced. If you are not, if you are just a traveler who wants to sit on the sand, finding a spot that does not feel like you are occupying someone else's territory requires some navigation. The further you get from the main strip, the more this resolves. At the central beach, the beach in all the photographs is more organized and commercial than the images suggest. Compare this to Da Nang, where Mai Khe Beach stretches for 20 miles with almost no development on the sand itself, or to Hoi An, where the beaches nearby are quiet and unhurried. In both of those places, the beach feels like it belongs to everyone. In central Nha Trang, the beach feels like it belongs to the hotels. The second issue is the activity question. Nha Trang markets itself as an adventure and water sports destination. Diving, snorkeling, island hopping, kite surfing. And these things exist. The diving around the nearby islands is genuinely good, and the snorkeling tours are well organized and affordable. But outside of water-based activities, Nha Trang's offering is thin. The old town has limited historical depth compared to Hoi An. The cultural sites are real. The Po Naga Cham Towers are genuinely interesting and worth visiting, but there are not many of them. The food scene, while good, does not have the complexity or variety of Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi. After 2 days of beaches and 1 day of island hopping, I found myself wondering what to do next. In Hanoi, I never had that problem. In Ho Chi Minh City, I never had that problem. Nha Trang is a city where the answer to "what should I do today" is almost always go to the beach, which is fine if that is exactly what you came for, and limiting if it is not. The third issue is harder to name but easy to feel. Nha Trang has a transactional energy that the other Vietnamese cities I visited do not have to the same degree. In Hanoi, street food vendors remember your face. Neighbors greet you. The relationship between the city and the people who pass through it feels genuinely human. In Nha Trang's main tourist areas, the relationship feels more commercial, more practiced, more aware of the transaction at the center of every interaction. This is not a criticism of the Vietnamese people who live and work there. They are responding rationally to the economic reality of a city that has been heavily tourism dependent for over 2 decades. When your income depends on a constant stream of new visitors, the way you relate to those visitors naturally adjusts. But for a traveler who came to Vietnam specifically for the human warmth that the country is known for, Nha Trang's tourist core delivers less of it than anywhere else I went. Now let me tell you about the Russian signs and why they are there. Because understanding why Nha Trang has become what it has become, why the menus are in Russian and the supermarkets stock Russian chocolate and the real estate offices advertise in Cyrillic, requires going back further than most people realize. The connection between Russia and Nha Trang is not new. It did not start with the war in Ukraine or the sanctions of 2022. It started with the Cold War. During the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union was Vietnam's most important ally. Soviet engineers and military advisors worked throughout the country. Soviet ships used Cam Ranh Bay, a deepwater naval base 20 minutes south of Nha Trang, as a strategic outpost in Southeast Asia. This history created something that persists today: a generation of Vietnamese people who speak Russian, a cultural familiarity between the two countries that does not exist between Russia and most of Southeast Asia, a sense on both sides of a relationship that goes back further than tourism. When Russia began opening up in the 1990s and Russian citizens started traveling internationally for the first time, Vietnam was a natural destination. And within Vietnam, Nha Trang, with its beach, its warm water, its proximity to Cam Ranh Bay, which had by then become a civilian airport, was the natural base. By the 2000s, direct charter flights from Moscow and other Russian cities to Cam Ranh Airport were operating seasonally. Russian tourists discovered a beach city that reminded them of Soviet-era Black Sea resorts, but warmer, cheaper, and more exotic. The word spread. The numbers grew. By the 2010s, Russians were consistently the largest single foreign tourist group in Nha Trang, sometimes accounting for 30% or more of all international visitors. The city adapted. Russian menus appeared. Russian-speaking staff were hired. A neighborhood in the north of the city quietly became known as the Russian Quarter. All of this happened before February of 2022. Then the war started, and everything accelerated. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the Western response was swift and severe. Russian banks were cut off from the international payment system. The ruble collapsed. Major airlines suspended flights. European and American countries closed their airspace to Russian aircraft. For ordinary Russians, the world shrank overnight. And then in September of 2022, the Russian government announced a partial military mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of reservists were called up to fight in Ukraine. Within weeks, an estimated 800,000 Russians left the country. They went to Georgia, to Kazakhstan, to Serbia, to Armenia. And a significant number went to Vietnam, specifically to Nha Trang, a place many of them already knew, in a country that had maintained official neutrality and had not joined the Western sanctions. The infrastructure to receive them was already there. The Russian restaurants, the Russian-speaking staff, the charter flight routes that were quickly re-established via indirect paths. It just needed to scale up, and scale up it did. At the peak in 2023, estimates suggest somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 Russians were living in or regularly cycling through Nha Trang at any given time. In a city of 500,000 people, that is a visible and significant presence. What does this actually look like on the ground? Walk along Tran Phu Boulevard on any morning, and the concentration is immediately apparent. Russian conversation around you, Russian menus in the windows, Russian pop music from certain cafes. The supermarket on the corner stocks Russian instant noodles, Russian chocolate, Russian beer, alongside the Vietnamese products. Walk 2 streets back from the beachfront and you are in a Vietnamese Nha Trang that feels completely different. Local pho shops, Vietnamese families, morning markets. The Russian presence has not spread evenly across the city. It is concentrated in the tourist corridor and built outward from there. For the Vietnamese business owners in that corridor, the Russian influx has been largely positive economically. Occupancy rates in hotels went up. Restaurants that pivoted to serve Russian tastes saw revenues increase. Vietnamese entrepreneurs who spoke Russian found themselves in extraordinary demand. New businesses opened specifically to serve the community. A Vietnamese woman who had studied in Moscow opened a translation and visa services office. A local entrepreneur opened a Russian-style bakery. The economic opportunity was real, and local people responded to it. But there is another side to this story. I talked to Vietnamese residents, people who had lived in Nha Trang for decades, who had watched the Russian community grow from seasonal tourists to year-round residents, about what this transformation had meant for their city. The responses were nuanced, not uniform resentment, not uniform welcome. Several people described a cultural friction that had developed in certain neighborhoods. A small number of Russian residents had developed a reputation for treating Vietnam as a place without rules. Disputes with landlords, noise complaints, interactions in markets that local Vietnamese described as disrespectful. Most people were careful to distinguish between individuals and the broader community. The Russians who had learned Vietnamese words, who respected local customs, who came back to the same restaurants because they genuinely loved the food, those people were welcomed without reservation. The abstraction, the phenomenon of a large foreign community arriving suddenly and reshaping a neighborhood, was discussed with more ambivalence. One restaurant owner told me, "Nha Trang has always had foreign visitors. That is who we are. But there is a difference between visitors and people who move somewhere and expect it to become like where they came from." Now let me connect these two stories, because they are not separate. The reason I found Nha Trang the most commercially oriented, least authentically Vietnamese city I visited is directly related to its history as a tourism destination. Nha Trang has been hosting mass international tourism for longer than almost any other Vietnamese city. Soviet advisors in the 80s, Russian charter tourists from the 90s onward. Then a broader international crowd in the 2000s and 2010s. Decades of adapting to foreign visitors, learning what they want, building the infrastructure they need, pricing accordingly, has shaped the city in ways that are visible and permanent. This is not a criticism, it is a description. A city that has spent 30 years in the tourism business develops a different relationship with visitors than a city that has only recently started receiving them. The warmth is still there, but it sits alongside a practiced efficiency that is different from the unguarded openness you find in places less accustomed to being looked at. Nha Trang knows it is being looked at. It has known for a long time. Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City are large enough that the tourist layer sits on top of a city that exists for reasons entirely unrelated to tourism. You can step off the tourist street and disappear into real urban life immediately. Nha Trang is smaller and more tourism dependent. The tourist layer is proportionally thicker. Stepping off it requires more effort. So should you go to Nha Trang? Yes, with the right expectations. If you want a beach holiday in Vietnam, genuinely warm water, good diving, affordable and well-serviced city, Nha Trang delivers this very well. It is not the most beautiful beach in Vietnam. Phu Quoc has more dramatic scenery. The beaches near Hoi An have more charm, but Nha Trang is convenient, affordable, and the bay genuinely is as beautiful as the photographs suggest. If you are interested in the Russian community phenomenon, watching what happens when geopolitics displaces a large population and a small city absorbs the impact, Nha Trang is one of the most fascinating case studies in Asia right now. The Russian bakeries, the Cyrillic signs, the conversations in cafes between Vietnamese staff and Russian regulars who have been coming to the same table for 2 years. It is a living, complex, still evolving story. If you are looking for the Vietnam that surprised you, the warmth of Hanoi, the beauty of Hoi An, the energy of Ho Chi Minh City, Nha Trang will give you a version of those things, but not the fullest version. It is a city of trade-offs, beautiful bay, thin cultural offering, good infrastructure, commercial atmosphere, fascinating demographic story, complicated social dynamics. I left earlier than planned, but I left understanding Nha Trang better than I arrived. And understanding a place, even a place that does not fully work for you, is its own kind of reward. One last thing. On my final evening in Nha Trang, I walked to the northern end of the beach where the tourist infrastructure thins out. A few local families some fishermen pulling in nets, children playing in the shallows. The bay stretched south in the evening light. The hills behind the city were going dark. The water was the color it always is in that light, somewhere between green and silver. And for 20 minutes, Nha Trang was exactly what the photographs promised. It is in there, underneath the Russian menus and the hotel beach chairs and the island-hopping tours. You just have to walk a little further to find it. Thanks for watching. Have you been to Nha Trang? Did it work for you? Or did you feel the same thing I felt? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you are Russian and living there right now, I genuinely want to hear your perspective. This story has more sides than any single video can cover. See you in the next one.